I'm delighted to be here to tell what I think is an inspirational story about how parents who have been investigated by the child protection system or who had children removed and put into foster care or group homes, how those parents, working with their allies, transformed New York City's child welfare system, how they made dramatic changes to reduce the number of children in foster care from almost 50,000 in one city to fewer than 7,000 today. This process began in the early 1990s and continues today. The story has 5 parts. The first is what the conditions were in New York City before parents had a voice, a role in the child welfare system. The second I want to talk about is what parents did to change the city's policies and how the city operated. The third is I want to describe what those changes are, or at least some of the major changes that happened in the child welfare system. And then I want to talk about how that model of what happened in New York spread to other high-income countries. And finally, I want to talk about what can be done now to improve and increase the voice and power of parents to change the child welfare systems in different countries and to improve the lives of their children and their families. So, to begin with, the conditions in New York City at the time that parents had no voice, in the early 1990s, New York City had one of the worst child welfare systems in the United States, if not one of the worst child welfare systems in high-income countries. There were 20 class action lawsuits against the city and the private foster care agencies for harming children. Children were removed very often because of poverty, not primarily because of abuse, but because of poverty, which is often confused with neglect. Children were in care for an average of 4 years. It took 7 years for a child to be adopted. One of the worst conditions in the child welfare system in New York in the early 1990s was that if a child was found to have been abused or neglected, in 40% of the cases, nothing happened. The child wasn't removed, the family got no help or any kind of assistance until the situation exploded. Parents, for the first time, began to organize, to fight back, to improve the system. Parents had fought back individually to try to keep their child with them or to be reunited with their children, but they never organized as a collective force to push the system to change. Parents had organized in other systems, in developmental disabilities, in mental health, in education, even in conditional cash transfer programs. Parents had worked to help their children as organizers, as pushers of systems, but never in child welfare until it began in New York City in the early 1990s. I want to briefly describe what my role was in helping to bring about these changes. A friend of mine in 1990 inherited a considerable amount of money. And the requirement of the will was that she give the money away. And I had the good fortune of being asked by her to help her give it away. And she wanted to remain anonymous. So I got a lot of the credit for the good work that this foundation did. And we created a foundation called the Child Welfare Fund. We gave away about $1 million a year in small grants to community organizations, $20,000 to $25,000 each. We operated on a principle that we learned in the 1960s in the civil rights movement. that people have a right to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. And if people participate in the decisions that affect their lives, there's a greater chance that their needs will be met and their rights will be protected. That's what we used as the foundation of what kinds of programs we supported. We developed a strategy with 3 parts. We didn't start with a strategy, we developed it as we went along. And we made a lot of mistakes as we went, but we learned from our mistakes. And I want to describe the 3 aspects of our strategy. The first part is we trained parents to be advocates, to advocate for themselves and then to advocate for others. The training program had 3 parts, and it was for parents who had been through the child welfare system, parents who had had a child removed or they had been investigated by protective services. And these parents learned from what they had done, changed their lives, were reunited with their children, and then learned to be advocates first for others and then for themselves. The training program that they went through had 3 parts. The first part was classroom training, where parents learned the laws, the regulations of the child welfare system, how to speak in public, how to testify at a legislative hearing. The second part was an experiential learning program, where the parents being trained worked in child welfare agencies under the supervision of an existing parent advocate working with a social worker. The third part of the training was support groups, where parents who were being trained to be advocates would get together, talk about what problems they were experiencing, how they might do things in a way that would be helpful for them. Once parents were trained, they began to work in child welfare agencies. John Mattingly was the commissioner of the child welfare system. That's the person who is the head of the public child welfare agency. And he became a strong supporter of having parents who had been through the child welfare system be advocates to help others. And I want to read what he said. He said, "Everywhere you look in the city where we are doing our best work, where the best is happening, you find parent advocates around." When we began, there was a lot of resistance from social workers. They felt parents would second guess them, they would tell them what to do. The parents who were advocates might violate the confidentiality of the parents, or the parent advocates might re-experience the trauma that they experienced when their children were taken away. And this happened in some cases, but generally parent advocates work as collaborators with social workers. Research has shown that when parents work as advocates with parents who are going through the system, everybody feels better. Everybody does well. The parents themselves feel like they've been treated and listened to better. The social worker feels that she's been more effective at her work. And the parent advocate feels good about the experience. One of the people in the audience today has done the research that documents this. Maria Lalaliance is here, right there. I think you should talk to her. She has the documentation that not only do people feel better when there's a parent advocate present, but it reduces the number of children who are placed in care, the length of time they spend in care. The second part of the strategy was that we wanted to change how the social work community and the press saw parents. Parents who had been through the child welfare system were demonized. the most extreme cases of abuse were what reached the press, what the stories that the public saw, when in fact these extreme cases of abuse are extremely rare within the child welfare system. The vast majority of children who are placed into foster care are placed for reasons of neglect, not because of abuse. In fact, 60% of the children who come into care are there because of neglect, which is often confused with poverty. So what did we do to change how the social work community and the press saw parents? The first thing we did was we supported a publication called Rise Magazine. Has anybody read or seen Rise Magazine? Yes, one person is. Well, I encourage the rest of you to look at it. It's free online. He's shaking his head. It's a great publication. It's written by parents from across the United States about what their experiences were, what led them to having a child taken from them, and what their recommendations are for how the system can better meet their needs. The second thing that we did was to support a similar publication called Represent. It's written by and for youth in foster care, so their voice can be heard. The third aspect of these publications was a publication called the Child Welfare Watch, which was written by academics and parents critiquing a different aspect of the child welfare system. Every 6 months there'd be a public forum where the issues raised in this newsletter was discussed on a panel where a representative of the government, the researcher, and a parent was present to talk about the situation. Another thing we did to change how the public and social work community saw parents was we created 3 awards, cash or grants. The first was to parents who worked hard, valiantly, to be reunited with their children. We had a public ceremony. Each parent got $1,000. We had about 10 or 20 parents selected each year so that people would see the humanity of parents who really wanted to be reunified with their kids. We had another award for youth in foster care. Youth in foster care are often stigmatized. We created an award for youth who helped other people, and there were public ceremonies for them also. And the third award was for social workers who went above and beyond the call of duty to help children and their families be reunited. All these activities began to change how the community saw parents who had been investigated and had children removed. There's a principle in sociology that contact reduces prejudice. And that's what happened in child welfare. The community began to see parents in ways other than as clients, other than as victims. They saw them in their full humanity. Parents who loved their children, they needed help to take care of them. The third part of the strategy was to support community grassroots organizations of parents who worked together to create a countervailing force to push government to change. My experience with large organizations is that they're extremely effective at incorporating change to maintain the status quo. That unless governments are pushed, they only do what's convenient for them. You need this countervailing force. And we supported organizations that would create that pressure of parents and allies working together to push the government to change. These organizations that we supported were made up of people who were affected by the child welfare system, who had needs. It was an alliance of parents and their allies. The most effective of these organizations was called the Child Welfare Organizing Project, but there were a half a dozen other groups that we also supported. One interesting one was Voices of Women. It was a group of survivors of domestic violence who felt that the court system abused them as much as their partner abused them. And they organized to push the court system to change. This picture over here is these parents organized in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral in central Manhattan. Many of the foster care agencies, more than half of them, are run by Catholic agencies in New York. And this is an example of a child who was killed in foster care. This was a demonstration against that kind of care. Hope that children can remain with their families with support rather than be taken away. All this activity brought about significant changes in the child welfare system. I want to mention 4 of the most significant ones. As I mentioned before, in 1990, there were almost 50,000 children in foster care or group care. We use the term foster care to include any out-of-home placements. Almost 50,000 children in one city. It's a city of about 8 million people. A child was removed from his or her family every 45 minutes. Today, there are fewer than 7,000 children in foster care in New York. This is an extraordinary change from 50,000 to 7,000. It took 15 years, but that is what happened. And the number of children in care has remained that low for at least the last 5 to 7 years. The second significant change that came about is that previously, when a child was at risk of being removed from a parent's care, the parent had terrible legal representation. They were represented by a lawyer who had no special training in child welfare, who had no backup support to investigate the case from the perspective of the parent. And worst of all, the lawyer met the parent on the day of the legal proceeding. So in virtually every case, the parent lost custody of the child when the case went to court. Today, parents are represented by an interdisciplinary legal team, including a lawyer who has special training in child welfare, a social worker who can investigate what the family situation is from the perspective of the parent, and a parent advocate who makes sure that the voice of the parent gets heard in the court proceedings and during the time that the case is being prepared. This model of interdisciplinary legal representation has been evaluated and found to reduce the length of time children remain in care by 4 months on average for all children. This saves New York City government $50 million a year, which has made the government extremely enthusiastic about having good legal representation for children and their parents. The third change that happened is that there are many more services available, evidence-based services to support families whose children are not placed into foster care. There's still a shortage of special kinds of services. There's not enough mental health services for families. There's not enough substance abuse programs for mothers who have children. And there's definitely not enough housing. A large percentage of the children who come into foster care come in from the housing system. Their parents are homeless, and the kids end up in foster care. The fourth change is that parents now have a significant voice in child welfare on their individual case, working in programs, and in trying to change public policy in child welfare. Before a child is removed, we have what is called an initial child safety conference. That's where the social worker, a parent, and now a parent advocate meet to discuss whether the child can remain safely at home. Last year, there were 10,000 initial child safety conferences. At each one, a parent advocate who had been through the system or somebody living in that community was present to help make sure that the parent's voice gets heard and that a safety plan could be developed, if possible, so that the child could remain safely at home. This has also reduced the number of kids who have gone into foster care, and the kids who go into foster care, more of them are now staying in kinship homes with relatives. Parents speak on advisory panels. The Commissioner of Child Welfare in New York and in many other jurisdictions have established advisory boards of parents who have been through the system, who give comments on new policies that the Commissioner is going to develop, and they make their own suggestions of what they think the Public Child Welfare Agency should do. Some of these advisory panels are really tokenistic and just window dressing, but some listen to the voice of parents and make a difference in how policy is implemented. Parents now speak in schools of social work and law schools to train the next generation so that they become sensitive to what the needs are and the perspective of parents. As I mentioned, parents write for Rise magazine. I don't think I mentioned the address. It's www.risemagazine.org. I really encourage you to read it. It's not just a newsletter, but there's training programs. It's a source of support. Contacting them could help you start similar kinds of programs here. In addition, it took almost 20 years for this to happen, but all foster care contracts require that parent advocates work in every foster care agency to make sure that a parent advocate is available so that when children are in foster care, they can work with the family to speed up the reunification process. I want to talk about how this idea of parent participation in peer-to-peer support and also in policy advocacy spread throughout the world. The origin of this was really among the Maori in New Zealand. One of the cultural practices historically of the Maori was to have what they called family group conferences, where if a family was having difficulty, if a child was at risk, the community would come together to talk about how that family could be helped. Family, relatives, neighbors, religious leaders would all get together and talk about how to help one particular family. In 1989, that concept became law in New Zealand. And that idea then spread to New York and to other high-income countries. And now it has spread through many high-income countries around the world. Today there are at least, and I think there are considerably more, at least 100 peer-to-peer support parent advocacy programs in child welfare in at least 10 countries. We haven't been able to survey all countries, but these countries include Australia, Canada, Scotland, Wales, England, Finland, and the United States. And new programs are starting to develop in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and in New Zealand. I'm certain I've left out some other countries where there are peer-to-peer support programs, and we're interested in learning about them if there are people here from those countries. I want to give a few examples of the kinds of programs that have been set up in just a few different countries. In Queensland, Australia, the Minister of, that's the Minister and that's me. The Minister of children, youth, and women created an advisory board of parents with lived child welfare experience. And one of the products of that advisory board was a Parents' Bill of Rights, so that parents begin to have rights in child welfare in Australia. It's just the beginning. There's no legislation supporting this Bill of Rights. There's no funding behind it. There's no sanctions, and there's no incentives. Nevertheless, it's a first step in the right direction. In Finland, the Central Union of Child Welfare sent a delegate to New York to see parent advocacy in action. Based on his review, he came back to Finland, described how effective the parent advocacy programs are. The Ministry of Health decided to fund a pilot project in Turku to create peer-to-peer support programs called From Customers to Companions. That program has been going for 3 or 4 years and has been refunded and is now working. I'm going to be going to Finland in another several weeks to see how it's operating. In England, at least 8 to 10 local authorities that administer child welfare systems in different cities have created peer-to-peer support programs. The most developed of these are in London, in Camden, and Suffolk. Parents have been trained to be advocates, but not only advocates, they also work on as advisors to the Director of Child Welfare to help him develop new policies that are more supportive of families. In England, there's also a network called PFAN, Parents, Families, and Allies Network. You can also see them online at pfan.org. They have literature, they have webinars, they have training, and they support advocacy campaigns to change policies in child welfare. Sweden is hoping to do something similar. And one of the people here today, Malin, and I'm sure I'm going to botch how to pronounce her name, Widulov, is in the process of trying to create a Swedish parent advocacy network. If anybody is interested in doing that here, she's the person to see. Compared to what existed 25 years ago, parent advocacy has expanded dramatically, but it's only reaching a very small percentage of families that could use the support of peer workers who have been through their shoes, who have experienced what they experienced. Much more needs to be done to help improve the child welfare systems. I want to end by talking about what needs to be done now, but I first want to describe and explain what I think is the reason that New York City's child welfare system changed as much as it has. There have been other major reform efforts in New York. There have been other infusions of additional money to improve the system. There have been other progressive commissioners. But each time the system improved and deteriorated. New York has had a roller coaster experience of child welfare, from crisis to reform back to crisis. That has not happened this time. I believe the main reason that the reforms this time have been deeper and lasted longer is because parents who have been through the system, working with their allies, became a collective force to push the system to change. Commissioners will change how things operate, but they need to be pushed. And I want to read a quote from one of the commissioners, the head of the child welfare system before John Mattingly, who I quoted from before. Commissioner William Bell, addressing an audience of parents and allies that was honoring the Child Welfare Fund, the foundation I mentioned before. Commissioner Bell said, "The New York City child welfare system has fundamentally changed over the last several years because you, parents, have forced us to change. Because you have said openly and loudly, things cannot continue to go the way they are going, and we listen to that. Peer-to-peer support has been incorporated and supported by many high-income countries. But peer-to-peer support is necessary, but it's not sufficient to really change a child welfare system. As I mentioned, you need a countervailing force to push governments to do more than what they would do without that pressure. You need organizations to push the system. Parents need to be trained. They need to be trained to be peer-to support workers and as policy advocates who will work to change how systems operate. You need to overcome the resistance of the social work community to change. People like doing what they've always been doing. There's a lot of fear. I think the main way people change is to change in this area is to have contact with parents in ways other than as clients, to see them, as I said, in their full humanity. Sweden can benefit from peer-to-peer support and parent advocates. I hope people contact Lund in the hopes that you'll create a similar program here. Martin Luther King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We need to be out there pulling that arc towards justice. Thank you very much. Selena said that we could have a question or two, or we can discuss it.
We can have one question.
I have a question. You mentioned parent advocacy, but is there also child who are from the system who bring their knowledge into the system?
Yes, there are. There aren't in New York organizations of just young people. There are national organizations of children in foster care. The closest there is to that in New York is this publication called Represent, where children, young people, youth present their perspective on the child welfare system. But we'll have plenty of chance to talk tomorrow, later today, this afternoon, in various workshops. Thank you very much.